Well, our second panel this afternoon is on the role of the United States in the world. So naturally, we tried to get as many British accents as possible on the panel. But we're thrilled to have, to my right, John O'Sullivan, who needs no introduction, but I'll give him a brief one anyway, editor-at-large of National Review and senior fellow at NRI, and until 2011, the executive editor of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Next to John is, we're thrilled to have Sebastian Gorka, who is the Deputy Assistant to President Trump on the White House National Security Staff. And finally, Michael Auslin, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of a book which, if you're not reading, you should be. And you'll be hearing a lot about it, no doubt, not only in the context of our discussion, but also in the coming months for sure. The End of the Asian Century, War, Stagnation, and the Risks to the World's Most Dynamic Region. The role of the United States in the world was the subject of no small amount of controversy in the recent election, no doubt because it's been a subject of controversy in Republican and conservative circles since the attacks of September 11th. Those attacks resulted, of course, not only in military operations, but a kind of an international drain the swamp operation that was premised on the idea that part of our security, at least, involved implanting democratic institutions, democratic ideals, maybe not with a lot of consideration about whether the culture was hospitable to those ideals, but at least that was the way the theory went, and it's obviously been an enterprise that's had mixed success. It's led to a lot of discussion and an unfortunate amount of ad hominem regarding whether the U.S. should turn inward to an isolationism reminiscent of the time before the 20th century's great wars, or whether validating our national character requires interventionism, even military interventions, in complex conflicts, even in the absence of obvious vital American interests, and sometimes even in the absence of congressional authorization. President Trump's solution to this dilemma has been to call for an America First foreign policy. It's a term that has some unattractive historical baggage, but which on its face could be understood as a call for a principled interventionism. So happily with Seb here, we won't have to speculate. Tell us, Seb, the president's understanding of America First. What's it mean?
Well, let's start by describing what it isn't, Andy. It's the opposite. It's the antithesis of the last 8 years. If you ignore the conspiracy theories of why the White House did what it did under President Obama, you just have to look at their actions. And they looked at the world very simply. Whatever serious problem was to be dealt with, whether it's the climate, whether it's terrorism, at the end of the day, America was responsible. That's what the last 8 years were. We are the new colonialists. Why, oh why, would they ship the bust of Churchill back to the British government as one of their first actions? Because the president was sending a very simple message. We aren't like the imperial colonial British. We reject that. And that's why we have what? The apology tour. Because we have to apologize for the way we have behaved as a nation in prior decades. So, number one, we jettison, we reject the idea that America is the root of all that is wrong in the world. On the contrary, we look back at the last century and we say, what are the greatest existential threats to Western civilization? They've always been the rise of totalitarian ideologies, whether it was fascism and Nazism or whether it was communism. And how were those totalitarian threats dealt with? Was it Belgium that solved it? Was it Vanuatu? Of course not. It is no accident that to crush the Third Reich took America's involvement in World War II. to undermine and delegitimize the totalitarian ideology of the Soviet Union, it took decades and decades of American commitment to the values on which this republic was founded. And in the final analysis, we have the man here who wrote the book about the president, the prime minister, and the pope. It took American leadership with British leadership and the papal see to undermine from inside the message of the communist totalitarians. This president has recognized very early, I saw this in his eyes when I met him in the summer of 2015 before anybody took him seriously as a candidate. I knew one thing about Donald J. Trump. He understands we are at war. He understands it in his marrow that we are at war. And secondly, he wants to win that war. And the important thing about this war is that it is a totalitarian threat again. Not one that worships an Aryan race and a 1,000-year Reich, like the Nazis. Not one that worships Karl Marx and the utopian workers' paradise that always seem to be just a little bit further away. It's a hybrid totalitarianism that is religiously informed, and which the president has quite rightly labeled radical Islamic terrorism. So what does America's role in the world today mean? It means that we are back. We're not going to have any more this oxymoronic leading from behind. Leading from behind, what does that mean? It means following, yes? Right? I mean, that's what it means. So we are going to return. We're going to be on the front stage. You look at the response to Secretary Mattis and Vice President Pence's visit to Europe. People are thirsty for the leadership that the White House has failed to provide in the last 8 years. And it's a very simple formula. The world, everybody's world, is safer when America is leading. When America isn't leading, others will fill the vacuum. And when that happens, it's not good for America and it's not good for our friends.
John, about America leading and what should inform that. You've written eloquently, as always, but recently about nationalism and in particular the way it's informed by a patriotic sense of what it means to be an American and what it means to be America. How does that inform an America first foreign policy in the best sense of that term?
Well, I think the key point to make, first of all, is that what a government is. A government is a guardian of the interests of the nation. That's what it's elected to do. People don't elect an American government to be a guardian of everything else. And half the 19th century novels and plays were about wicked guardians trying to get control of their ward's interests. Well, that's obviously, a government is supposed to do the opposite. So that's what America First, in my mind, means. That's the first thing you do is look after American interests. And sometimes they're very obvious, and sometimes they're not so obvious. Now, the second point about there being not so obvious is there are a number of things in the world which can easily be handled, and which, for example, I would say the question of sex trafficking and people trafficking in general. I'm not offended by the idea that America should be a country which takes the lead, and I don't think most conservatives are in combating that kind of thing. It obviously comes under the heading of responsible international leadership. I mean, the British, for example, stopped the international slave trade in the 19th century. Nobody now says, well, what business was it of theirs? I mean, and it was something which civilized people felt had to be done, and I think America takes the lead there. The third point is, and illustrate the story, I was on Bill Maher's program a few years ago, and they were discussing whether or not America should remain in Iraq. And of course, I was the only person in the panel who felt they should, and I said so. And I came under some criticism. But my point was to say this, really. Look, you can leave Iraq, but events are going to drag you back. There's no way you will be able to stay out indefinitely. Now, that's not true of all international disputes. There are a lot of international disputes which you can stay out of, and which the powers on the ground, or maybe former colonial powers, or maybe international organizations can handle. And I don't think America should always be the first person, but it is obviously the case that if America doesn't help something, doesn't approve of something, then it tends not to happen practically. Even the European defense policy, for example, is almost always dependent upon the logistical support of American forces, European defense policy. So you've got to realize simply that by virtue of being the biggest elephant in the room, you're going to end up a lot of the time drawing burden behind you. I think you have to make prudent judgments. And they have to be, finally, this is my last point, they have to be your judgments. I'm very much opposed to this idea that we sit around in a room somewhere for 20 years before events happen, and we agree on an international treaty which commits sovereign powers to take actions if certain things are happening. Now, normally the case is genocide, and that's easier than most questions to try to know what to do, but they're not all that. I don't believe that you can have a situation in which great powers agree to be bound by the decisions of international organizations in matters which are of no interest to them or could even be contrary to their interest. And so what happens in such circumstances is somebody says, we're committed by a treaty to do this, and the government therefore says, we don't want to do that, so we'll deny the evil is happening. What you've got to have is responsibility, but that means it's your responsibility to decide these things. And generally speaking, America, I think, has been a moral leader, as I believe the British Empire was before it, in these questions. And I'm content to leave the answers it gives to the American people and its government.
It is an area that defies. We can have overriding principles, but to have antecedent rules and procedures imposed on it, particularly when the situations we're faced with get complex. I think a lot of what the debate about Syria was over the last 5+ years has been the fact that while there's immense human suffering ongoing and continues to be, there are enemies of the United States on both sides of the conflict.
Well, that's right, and I think the problem with Syria from the standpoint of intervention was this, that it looked as though our allies in Syria on the ground, the people who will be doing the fighting, were the losing side of the losing side. And although I might very much want them to triumph, it looked, first of all, to be impossible, and secondly, more likely to prolong rather than to solve the conflict. I think in some circumstances, you have to accept the fact that for some time, the wrong side will win if it brings about an end to the conflict, a conflict which, if it continues, will result in more and more innocent people dying. I don't think such questions are easy to answer, and I'm jolly glad that I'm not in a position where I have to answer them. But the point is that if you're a president of the United States, Prime Minister of Great Britain, if you're a pope, and as you were saying, you have to be prepared to answer those questions and to do so with the best moral outcome, remembering the best moral outcome won't always be very nice.
Speaking of complexity and trying to divine what the right answer is, Asia. We've spent so much time and energy on terrorism, the Middle East, and North Africa. As you point out, Misha, in your book, we have an area of the world which is 60% of the world's population, 40% of global economic output. America's role in Asia, given a situation where we could be in a war, perhaps with Korea at any time. China stagnating, Japan stagnating, radical Islam making inroads in Indonesia. How do we look at Asia?
Well, and I think the problem that we face in Asia is that it's been a pretty easy game for us until now. And we had the luxury, it might not have been wise, but we had the luxury for the last 15 years really not pay that much attention to Asia. I mean, I think we should have. And in doing so, we might have saved ourselves some of the grief that we're experiencing now. But largely, if you look at our post-World War II experience in Asia, it was a gimme. There was no power that could really contest American supremacy, that really threatened our allies in a very physical, direct way. Obviously, we had the Cold War. We wanted to bottle up the Soviet Union. But China was very inward-looking. And the irony, which I think historians will eventually appreciate, that at almost the moment the wall comes down and the Cold War ends, China explodes onto our consciousness for very good reasons, because of the beginning of its economic growth, as well as the reassertion of very traditional claims that it had. So while we sort of step back and think, well, we've had this great strategy now in Asia for 70 years, we've had these alliances and the like, the truth is we've never been tested. We're being tested now for the first time by a nuclear North Korea that is a failure, a bipartisan failure of both Republican and Democratic administrations over the past quarter century to give us the one thing they promised us we wouldn't have, by the way, which is a nuclear North Korea, and obviously by a resurgent China and a revisionist China. So that at the moment that our strategy, such as it was, faces a real world test, we now have panicked and don't know how to respond. And obviously it is an extraordinarily complex region. But what it really does is bring to us the fear, as I think Russia does in its own way, that we are back into a pre-1945, if not 19th century world of great power competition. That world we thought ended in 1989. We thought that great power politics had ended in 1989. We didn't solve radical Islamic terrorism, Islamist terrorism. We haven't solved that yet. But now you layer on top of it the very thing that our country was born into, in a sense, a world of competing great powers and struggling for our own independence and then struggling through that world to get us to 1945. We, I think, are not equipped yet to understand how we fight what is, in essence, a two-front battle. One we haven't solved for the past 16 years, and one that we recognize that the potential stakes, be it in Europe or definitely in Asia, would dwarf anything we've done since 9/11. And because we've been paralyzed, I think, and because we're risk averse as a status quo great power, superpower, now the risk is higher. So the cost of getting involved on the Korean Peninsula is higher. The cost of getting involved in the South China Sea is higher. And we have not yet gone through the process to understand how much risk is enough, how much will we tolerate before we decide that the environment which we want to live in has changed too much. That, I think, is the debate we're moving into. That's where I think, in something John mentioned and Seb was talking about, to understand what a prudential realism looks like, a realism that does not shrink from engagement but also understands the natural limitations. When you think about engaging with China at this level, you must think about that way. It cannot be an open-ended type of conflict as we've sort of become used to. So we are now, I think, at the very beginning of that process, and that is something I think the administration will struggle with as much as those of us on the outside.
Well, there's not a lot of time to think about it in the long term between when President Trump meets with President Xi,
Right.
Probably within the next 3 weeks or so, right? You get a chance to give President Trump some advice. What do you tell him? And are there lessons to be learned, do you think, from the summit we just had with the Japanese Prime Minister?
Yeah, very briefly, I would say number one, President Xi's number one concern is his own power right now. He's heading into a party Congress. He is trying to upend the last 40 years of Chinese collective leadership. He has, as you mentioned, an economy that is stagnating, which is causing domestic problems, which is the greatest fear of this regime, which is an illegitimate regime in the eyes of many in China, especially once the economic benefits of the past 30 years begin to slow down. Understand that his main concern is to keep stability abroad for China, because any sense that they are losing Asia, losing control of the position that they have built up over the past 10, 15, or 20 years will redound directly to doubts about him. So the pressure points that you can use against him are, in terms of the South China Sea, to maintain, to not continue the belligerent approach, number one. Number two, don't let North Korea get out of hand, because we will intervene. That is a commitment we've made, and you will not be able to control that. Number two. Number three, on trade. You're going to blink first. You don't want a trade war because your economy is far weaker than ours. You can't replace us as a market. We can find new suppliers. I think those 3 points shape the approach to understand that President Xi, for all of the Davos bluster that he has, is in a much weaker position than President Trump in our country.
Seb, President Putin also seems to project an image that may be at odds with the actual power of his position. There's been a lot said about Russia in the last 10 minutes, probably, but certainly a lot said about Russia in the election. Talk about Russia, how the administration sees NATO. What kind of dynamic are we expecting going forward? With respect to NATO in particular, what is the mission? Is Russia the good guys, the bad guys? If they're the bad guys, is NATO's mission what it used to be? If NATO's mission isn't what it used to be, is it counter Islamic terrorism? Mm-hmm. Where are we at?
Okay, Russia, the administration in Russia. I always find the safest thing to do is to quote your boss. If you really want to understand, I also like to remind people, we are in week 8 of the administration, right. Not month 8, week 8. So things are taking shape. But the best indication of how things could develop with Moscow is to listen to the president's own words. It was the last press conference he gave in Trump Tower. I don't know if you recall, before we moved into the White House, he made the ground floor of Trump Tower a giant press conference area. And after the press conference, after the statement, there was a question and answer period, and one of the questions was on Vladimir Putin, and how are you going to build relationships, and what do you expect? And the president made a very, very short but very clear statement. He looked at the questioner, looked at the audience, and said, I would like to have good relations with Moscow. At the moment, it doesn't look very likely, and if that's the case, so be it. It's essential to understand who this man is. He's not only the most powerful man in the world, but he's also a man who has a history as what? An incredibly successful businessman. And as such, you cannot be a successful real estate developer in New York, okay, hardest market in the world, unless you are eminently pragmatic. That statement was a statement of pragmatism. Monica Crowley, who's a friend, I will state this on the record, okay, Monica Crowley, said something very important before the inauguration. She said most of the commentariat, the chattering classes, totally misunderstood who Donald J. Trump is. He is not an ideological candidate. You can't fit him into a box. It's impossible to fit him into a neat little category. He's not ideological, he is attitudinal. And she was absolutely right. I've seen it, I've watched it close up in the Roosevelt room, when he's negotiating, when he's talking to his guests, when he's in a listening session. This man is interested in one thing above all else: excellence for America. For him, it was excellence for the Trump organization. Now he's translated that to the nation. He wants the best for all Americans. He'd like to be able to do that with as many people as possible. But if it doesn't work, we're not going to fall into the trap of the last 8 years, which is when we make the ideal the enemy of the good. That will not happen in a Trump administration. They say that politics is the art of the possible. Well, yes, it is, but so is strategy. Strategy, above all else, is not about the perfect. You look at the world as it is, and you deal with it as it is. This isn't Machiavelli. This is just looking at the world in ways that aren't distorted through a lens. So with Russia, if we can, because it would be great. If not, we'll cope with that as well.
Well, it's one thing not to be so wedded to ideology that you're hamstrung, but there's always, even in being practical, there's certain assumptions that go into the mix, right? So with respect to a number of us who've had concerns about Russia, the president has at least suggested that maybe there's the possibility that Russia could be of some assistance to us in the struggle against radical Islam. That's a tough sell for a lot of us who have watched this over the years particularly seeing a growing partnership, it seems, between the Russians and the Iranians, and realizing that Iran is not only the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, but Iran's number one and nearly only requirement with respect to terrorism is that it be anti-American. So they'll
Yes.
help Sunnis, they'll help Shiites. They historically have been the bridge between the two, and the only requirement is death to America, death to Israel. Is there a reason to think that we can expect help from the Russians and the Chinese? And I'm going to ask you as well, Misha.
The only way to answer that question is to ask the Russians. I mean, we always ask about America's policy in the US and Washington. It's almost fallacious to always posit that Russia's behavior is something that is isolated from Russia. Russia will be part of that decision matrix, what they see as their ambitions and their goals. There's a... Andy.
Thank you.
So the question is the following. We, as an administration, came into office because the majority of the people in America, through the Electoral College, agreed with our assessment that there is a global threat to America from a totalitarian ideology that is religiously fueled, radical Islamic terrorism, be it Sunni, such as ISIS, or be it Shiite, such as Quds Force, IRGC, the Islamic Republic. So we have said this is a global problem. And whether you are a German citizen going to a Christmas market or a tourist in Nice, or whether you're going to a nightclub in San Bernardino, this threat is a threat to all of us. My question is, does Moscow look at that threat in the same way? And I'm not sure. I'm not going to talk for Moscow, but do they see jihadism per se as a global threat to everybody, or do they only tackle it because it's a threat to us, to Dagestan, to the Caucasus, to my region? If they see it as a global threat, then there is a commonality of interests. They enter into a community of values, a community of shared concerns. And you asked me, I didn't answer the question, but you asked me about NATO. I mean, let's talk about NATO for 1 millisecond. Why is it called the most successful military alliance in modern history? For one very simple reason. For 40 years, from 1949 to 1989, Portugal agreed with Canada on what the threat was. I mean, let's think about that for a second. Luxembourg agreed with the United States that the primary threat to all of us is something called communism, the Soviet Union, and the Warsaw Pact. NATO's future relies once again on that key dynamic. Do we have a shared threat perception? And I think after the recent visit by the Vice President, by Secretary Mattis, it is clear that NATO is on the path to revitalization and understands that, yes, we are bound together not just through history, but through a new revitalized shared threat assessment. If that threat assessment remains solidified, if it is truly a consensus, then NATO will have a great role in the future with America as part of it.
Misha, let me ask you about China and Iran. How does China view Iran? Are they an ally? Are they a customer? Are they a thorn in the American side?
China doesn't have allies, first of all. That's one thing we don't think about so much. You know, we think everyone's sort of lining up on China's side. They have no real, I mean, if North Korea is your ally, yeah, you can have them. But other than that, they really don't have any allies. You know, it's very transactional, everything that China does. Let me just answer very quickly the question you didn't ask about radical Islamism. China would like us to think that we face a common enemy. The reality is that in China, what is radical Islamism is separatism in Xinjiang and East Turkmenistan. And they've talked to us about, we're in this fight together, so why don't you help us deal with this problem, which is really a problem of suppressing separatism. Because when you suppress separatism in Xinjiang, you're suppressing it in Taiwan and Hong Kong and other places in Tibet that don't want to be part of China. Right. So we have to think very carefully when we do talk to China, because when we give them that type of support, or we invite them into, for example, international peacekeeping operations. They don't send their military, by the way. They send internal security forces, because what we're doing is teaching them internal suppression techniques. So we have to think very carefully about how we would want to work with them and if it's legitimate at all. In terms of Iran, if you want to talk about an old hoary concept, the axis of something, certainly the connection that China has with North Korea and North Korea's connection with Iran, I think, is probably more salient in some ways than a direct Beijing-Tehran connection, although it is there. It's not as allies, it is partly as partners, or partly as customers, as you put it. But it is more a broader sense that I think Seb was getting at in the concept of how, as a major player, if you're China, do you, in essence, if not foment, give some type of support to the disorder in the system that we have helped maintain? Why was NATO so successful in that identification of a common enemy? Here you press so many different points so that you can't identify your one enemy. I mean, in my case, is it radical Islam? No, it might be China in the South China Sea or North Korea. But you are putting pressure into all of those different positions so that anything that delegitimizes the United States, delegitimizes and frustrates our actions is something that, quite frankly, we haven't yet been willing to admit China supports. And they do it against sanctions with North Korea. They've done it against Iran. They do it vis-a-vis Russia with just sort of a condominium of interests. We have been hamstrung by our fear of disrupting the trade relationship from really calling reality what it is. And if there's one area where I think the president has actually rocked the Chinese back on their heels for maybe the first time since President Nixon went to Beijing, it's in saying that, everything is actually on the table. And even if he withdrew it in his phone call to Xi Jinping, they know that he put it on the table and it can go back on the table. And that has changed the dynamic. So I actually expect you're going to see China itself making its own determination. How much farther do we push versus what is a prudent response to an America that actually seems to be changing its own playbook?
Let's move west, since we're short on time. Geert Wilders.
Yes.
Has to be, I would think, a little disappointed this morning in the outcome.
He's reasonably disappointed, but the mainstream parties have not got the reason to express the tremendous relief they're feeling. They've got a stay of execution rather than being released entirely from the populist threat.
Is the populist threat in some way unique in the Netherlands, or does what happened yesterday read onto Europe more broadly?
Well, first of all, I used the word populist, we both did, but I don't think we should. Populism is the word. It's the word of people who are not exactly enemies, but adversaries in politics. What is populism, really? Well, what you've had and what I think the Trump phenomenon in America is partly about, you've had establishments in Europe which have been pursuing agendas which many of their voters don't like, and probably a majority don't like a lot of it. How have they managed to do this? By the simple device of not talking about them, by keep saying, well, that shouldn't really be in politics, Immigration, we don't want to drag that into politics. We don't want to drag Europe into politics. There are things which shouldn't really be discussed. And they've managed to do that for something like 25 or 30 years, and every now and then you get an eruption against it. For example, both the French and the Dutch electors voted against the Maastricht Treaty in a referendum, but then the Lisbon Treaty, rather. But then the treaty was then brought back in a new form, and they were not given the chance to vote a second time. So what is populism? Populism is the democratic response on the part of discontented voters to the fact that a liberal oligarchy, in effect, liberal elites, have managed to push through a whole series of politics in an undemocratic way. You might say it's a response to the undemocratic imposition of, well, I wouldn't say liberalism today either. I would say progressivism or anti-nationalism or globalism or elite politics in general. And that's why, and what you're seeing now in populism is the rise of political parties which say, well, the existing parties don't actually represent us at all, and so we're going to support you to get back some of the democratic authority we thought we had. Brexit was, of course, the most important expression of that. But as Daniel will probably tell you, Brexit was both more and less. It wasn't, it's really not about some of the same issues. Immigration is important in relation to Brexit. Most people who felt strongly about immigration voted to leave. But on the other hand, the real question there was, can we get back our national sovereignty? Because Brexit was the one case in which opposition to elite progressivism was also opposition to powers being taken from your country and given to other countries. It's one thing for powers to be taken from you, the voter, and given to the courts or bureaucracies, but it has a sharper bite if the powers being taken are being taken from England and given to Brussels. And so Brexitism drew on nationalism, certainly it drew on immigration, it drew on a series of issues, but the principal thing it drew on was a feeling of the loss of sovereignty, and the loss particularly of democratic sovereignty. You know, we used to be a self-governing democracy, and we're not today. And we don't like that, and we see no reason why we should accept it. And that's what it seems to me. An awful lot of Americans, particularly progressive Americans, they have no grasp or insight of that at all.
Yeah. What about France? I mean, fair to say that whatever happens in France, it's going to be very different from what we have now.
Well, not necessarily, actually. Yeah. I'd like to think in a way, but I think we have to say this, that if the National Front were a normal party, it would probably win the presidency. But it's not. It's got baggage. And there are probably 40 or 50 or maybe even 60% of French people who will never vote for it. And that's a huge hurdle to overcome. There would have to be an enormous number of atrocities, of shootings and bombings, before enough Frenchmen voted for the National Front. But that doesn't mean to say the other parties don't realize the situation and we're going to have to learn from it. I would say that if the Conservative candidate, Fillon, who's of course hobbled, as you all know, by a financial scandal involving his family, if he were to become the president, I think he'd deal with it quite effectively. He's already made it plain that he stands for sensible, genuine, actually he's even said Thatcherite economic reform, which France badly needs. But he's probably not going to win. And she's probably not going to win. She herself in the past has said that it's not this presidential election, but the next one. But even then you have to take this into account. And this, of course, is where Donald Trump has some overlap, but not all. She won't have a party in the National Assembly. And there will almost certainly not be enough representatives who support her if she manages to win. Now, as we know, the president ran against the Democrats, but he was running against some Republicans as well. So he can't go back to Congress in quite the way, so to speak, normal Republican could and rely on support. She will be in that position multiplied by 10.
Seb, as far as the ideological aspect of the threat is concerned, I've been convinced myself that for a generation we've essentially stuck our head in the sand about it. Now that it's finally open and notorious to speak about, I still think we have to be a little more precise about what it is. And I think where this will manifest itself probably the most is immigration policy. But across a run of issues. And you talked about leading from behind before. I'm a little worried that we'll be leading from the bench the way things are going, certainly the way it's gone with the president's executive orders. Here's a question. I think that a big part of the problem that we've had is that when the radical Islamic threat struck us with immediacy and force in the early 90s, it presented itself as a jihadist threat. Mm-hmm. And we made jihadism the dividing line, such that if you were a jihadist, we were worried about you. If you weren't a jihadist, you were a moderate, okay? And we really didn't...
The good jihadist versus the bad jihadist.
Well,
right?
Yeah. I think Sharia supremacism is a more precise handle for it because it seems to me that if on one side of the Sharia supremacist line, you have pro-American, pro-constitutional Muslims, and I always remind myself and remind others that, the first Muslims I met prosecuting terrorism cases back when were the Muslims who were helping us infiltrate jihadist cells and break up plots without whom thousands of people would have been killed. On the other hand, it seems to me to be foolish to think that the only threat with respect to immigration is that you could have trained jihadists infiltrate themselves in refugee populations, because what we have to worry about is the Sharia supremacist or assimilation-resistant population that comes in and breeds the jihadist of 3, 5, 7 years down the road. How do we get a fix on what it is that we're targeting, and do we think that we can formulate an immigration policy that's going to ultimately pass muster with the court and protect the country?
Wow. I think you've got more experience in the judicial sphere, but I'll give it a shot. But first, if I may, with regards to the question you gave to John, we need to find a new word for populism, because populism is pejorative or has become pejorative. And the important thing about Brexit and the Trump train is it's not a pejorative function. The establishment arrived at a point where it wasn't just technically smarter than the average voter. They actually said, we're politically smarter than you. Brussels is going to decide for you because you're not fit as a voter to decide. DC, the establishment, knows better than you do about immigration. Leave that to us. That's when democracy breaks down. So the Trump train, the Brexit phenomena, is not some kind of negative groundswell of extremism. It's the reassertion of democracy. It's when the people say, no, you don't get to assert that you're smarter than me politically.
And the Ninth Circuit says, oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, no comment, no comment. So we need to find a new...
No comment?
No comment. We need to find a new word, because John's absolutely right. It's not populism. It is the essence of democracy. When the people say, I'm sorry, you don't have the right to decide for me what I get to decide upon. Right. It's a reassertion of democratic and republican principles in the original sense. So let's talk about the non-kinetic jihadi threat. I've had arguments with leading people in this field about the civilizational jihad, the Sharia, and all this stuff. And I have problems with all of these because, for the average voter, does the average American have any idea what Sharia is? I'm not sure they do.
I think probably more today than 5 years ago, but not nearly enough.
Okay. Right. So for me, it's very simple. I go to the antithesis. Let's not try and be incredibly clinical and discrete in the scientific sense about what the threat is, but let's look at the obverse, because it's very, very simple. And for me, it's all about the U.S. Constitution. Right? I don't care if you're a member of the KKK. I don't care if you're a member of the Communist Party. I don't care if you're an animal rights extremist who thinks humans can be killed to save, rabbits, or if you're a jihadi. The question is, what is your attitude to this? And my argument is a very simple one. We need to make the black flag of jihad as repugnant universally as the swastika, as the peaked white hood of the KKK. So we define it by what we're protecting. The biggest problem we've had in the last 16 years is allegedly this statement that, we don't know the enemy. Yes, we've been censored, especially under the Obama White House. We weren't allowed to call the enemy by what they call themselves, which is absurd. Right. The idea that you can't call a Nazi because you defend Germans, that's what the Obama regime said. You can't call a jihadi because somehow you'd inflame Islam. Well, no, let's get politics out of the system, out of the threat assessment. But at the end of the day, what's the issue? Does that given group wish to uphold these values or not? Because if they don't, that's the issue. Why is it? Why is it? I became an American citizen 5 years ago. And before that time, like John, we had to sign, as we came here, the visa waiver form on the plane, this long green form. Now, why was I asked on the visa waiver form whether I'm a member of the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany? Now, I've got a beard, I look older than I am, but I'm not that old, okay? So, yeah, Nazis are bad. I get it, absolutely, horrific. But why didn't it ask me if I'm a member of a Muslim Brotherhood organization? Why did it not ask me whether I'm into a Salafist organization that is in contravention of the US Constitution? Surely, after 9/11, that's perhaps a little bit more relevant than asking whether or not I'm a member of the Nazi Party.
Yeah. I think there's no doubt that that's true. The challenge, I think, that we're going to face in this system is whether, because of the overlay of First Amendment principles and religious liberty concerns, we're going to be able to get at the nub of the ideology. It's easy enough to say that jihadists are bad, right? They pose an immediate threat. The problem is going to be when you hold up the Constitution and you say, are you for this or not? You could be a non-kinetic jihadist or a Sharia supremacist, however you want to put it. The problem remains that there are 8 or 9 tenets that you believe that are antithetical to the Constitution.
Right.
And the question is, if you're not willing to blow up a bridge to bring that about, but you're still hospitable to those ideas, is there a way that we can keep you out of the country, or should we keep you out of the country? I mean, that's basically what the courts will wrestle with. I just saw a card get held up that we only have a couple of minutes to go, and I wanted to get to trade, which we haven't touched at all. Misha, let me ask you about TPP, basically the ditching of it, what it means, and in particular, what do you think of the notion that bilateral agreements are to be preferred over these multilateral monstrosities? Not that I'm trying to load the question.
It's a very complex question. I would say first, if what the president is willing to do is bilaterals, then we should push on those. And we should start with Japan and Britain so that you get the first, third, and fifth largest economies of the world more linked up, if by 2 bilats and then maybe somewhat more together. I was a proponent of TPP. I would have preferred to see it stay. I think that the types of access that it gave us, particularly to countries like Japan, meant opportunities that we didn't have, as opposed to jobs being lost. I think those jobs were actually lost quite some time ago, most of them. And in particular, you're talking about, the big market for us was Japan, where, there's still a 36% tax on U.S. beef, and we do $1.6 billion of sales a year, even with that tariff. You get rid of that tariff, you get rid of it on dairy, on soy, on all these other things. You reduce it on the automobiles through the non-tariff barriers. So I was in favor of it from the economics. The president is right, though. These plans need to be transparent. Free trade needs to be fair trade. And so he's right to say that you do, in this sort of democratization sense, you don't just leave this up to the mandarins to decide what it is. Let me just mention one thing, though. I think it was problematic in that we spent years, and the Obama administration was very dilatory in actually getting this, negotiating it first, and then, of course, they didn't get it through Congress. But our partners had gone along on the process. They had committed to it. Japan, Prime Minister Abe went way out on a limb to get this thing ratified. And so our withdrawal from it, I think, sent messages that we didn't want to send necessarily about working with the United States. And they felt the same way about President Obama. They were saying constantly, why are you not getting this ratified? You negotiated it. What is the delay? So I think it was a process that frustrated many of our partners. I'd like to see it back, but if we get bilaterals, then that's the way to go.
Okay, I'm glad you want to weigh in on this, John, because I also want you to address trade and Brexit and how they're interlinked if they are.
Well, I also want to talk about NATO and Ukraine.
Well then.
When NATO, I think the president is going to end up supporting NATO, as I believe NATO is going to be strengthened by that, for the simple reason that was really given by you, Sebastian, which is that NATO makes sense. Everybody knows it protects them. They don't, whatever complaints they have about it at different times, they always come back under crisis and Putin is delivering that pressure in a crisis. Secondly, look at the other things the president is doing. He's building pipelines. He's encouraging fracking. He's increasing defense spending massively. He's talking about rebuilding scientifically, in other ways, the US nuclear armory. These things strike at the very basis of Putin's interests and his aggressiveness. So that tells you that in a sense, reality is a factor in all of these things. Ukraine, I mentioned this because whatever deal we do with Russia, and by the way, other things being equal, we should want to have reasonable relations with Russia. It's an important country. But whatever deal we do cannot be at the sacrifice of Ukraine, because that would undercut all of the other good things we would be doing with NATO and our other allies. So we have to maintain the independence of Ukraine. And anyway, by the way, if we tried to sell them out, they wouldn't be sold out.
But let me just clarify what you mean.
Yeah.
Do you mean that what they've done in the way of territorial conquest can't stand?
I think what they've done in the way of, I think the status quo is that the Russians are breaking the Minsk Accords, which when they go, so we have to insist that those accords be kept. What will happen about the other two territories, Crimea and Donbass? Crimea, I would put that into cold storage for the moment, actually, but never yielding it de jure, but accepting, put it on one side for the minute. As regards the Donbass, I would say, first of all, it's not controlled by Kiev, so Kiev shouldn't pay any of its bills. Its costs should be paid by Moscow. In the meantime, we should do what we're doing, which is to try to build up Ukraine and to create a circumstance identical, in a way, to the competition between East Germany and the Federal Republic through the Cold War, which we won in the end because freedom and prosperity made the other place look like a slum. And people don't want to live in slums. They want to live in countries with a future.
On that enthusiastic and optimistic note, thank you very much to our panelists, John O'Sullivan, Sebastian Gorka, and Michael Auslin. Thank you.